Hey, it's Terry with Something Spooky. Thank you for joining me and happy Halloween. This is kind of a special video because I will be reading some of my own stories for the first time ever. These are from my new book, Graveyard Games and Other Scary Stories, which I just released, and it's available on Amazon and paperback and digital. Please check it out if you get the chance. I would really appreciate it. I'm going to be reading the title story, Graveyard Games. The pink paint of the Fisher-Price tricycle had faded almost white by the sun. The plastic was scuffed and worn with punctures and dents accenting the age of the toy. Today it was precariously perched on the roof of the small shed on the skirt of the graveyard where the groundskeeper, Henry, stored his tools and equipment. Henry shielded his eyes from the light as he stood and stared up at the artifact. He tended the yard every other day, even though once or twice a week would probably suffice. He thought that if he were the one laying in the ground, he wouldn't appreciate it if some lucky living slob only bothered to make it by when the leaves had thoroughly covered the paths or the grass was high enough to tickle your ankles. He didn't have much else to do since dropping out of his night classes at the community college. He did what he had been doing for 22 years. He kept Glenwood Cemetery in pristine shape every week of the year. He spent at least 2 hours every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and either Saturday or Sunday, depending on the week, and how much he had indulged himself to drink the night before, trimming the hedges, cutting grass, picking up trash, and straightening the memorial decorations left by loved ones, all through the wide and winding graveyard. He wasn't accountable to anyone and had no one to report to. The busy folks at City Hall probably didn't even remember he was the groundskeeper. It was a matter of personal pride and work ethic, not to mention an act of respect for those who had loved, laughed, and lived full lives, who now rested under the shade of dirt 365 days a year with no scheduled reprieve. The tenants that could be said about were the lucky ones. There were a few headstones in the yard with dates on them as close enough together that Henry's 22 years as their guardian had more than tripled their time on this earth. It was a thought that had occurred to Henry many times and arose more frequently as his time in the place lengthened and his own mortality became clearer. Why was it that some of these angels never made it to the 5th grade while he was allowed to lazily poke about with no real purpose or plan for 40-odd years? The pink tricycle did nothing to exercise these ruminations. He sometimes wondered, after retrieving it from whatever impossible corner of the cemetery he picked it in, if it was not there to cause this reflection. For 22 years, the child's toy had lingered around the graveyard. It started in the summer of 1984, on the first Monday that Henry inspected the cemetery. In those days, it was a paid position, and Henry was a married man without a college degree. He had worked odd jobs since graduating from high school, mostly in construction and maintenance. The groundskeeper position was only part-time and paid the meager minimum wage of the day, but it was at least a year-round steady income. Years later, the city turned the position into volunteer work, but Henry, partially out of habit, maybe out of duty, or perhaps something else altogether, stuck with it. But in June of 1984, with an expecting wife at home, he needed every dollar he could scrounge. He remembered clearly finding the tricycle lodged forcefully into the gutter that first day. At the time, he thought nothing of it, and after wresting it from the sewer's grasp, tossed it carelessly into the field across the street. He had assumed reasonably that it belonged to a child from the neighborhood and had found its way there either by horseplay or happenstance. He had continued working under this assumption for the first 6 months of the year, and why not? It was just a lost toy, and no matter how many times he found it somewhere on the grounds, he didn't think much of it. It wasn't until December of that year, when the first snow had blanketed the stone markers with a gentle dust, that Henry first considered anything further. Something about the sight of that pink bike, faded and worn even then against the field of white snow, triggered a suspicion in his brain. At this point, his wife was set to be due any day. They had already started to unearth their struggles and incompatibilities. It had been a hard couple of months. Perhaps driven by this attitude, for the first time, Henry locked the tricycle in his shed. It sat there undisturbed through the week, but the next Monday morning, without cause or explanation, was waiting outside the shed. In the days between, Henry had lost his wife and their daughter in birth. It's a wonder he stumbled into work that day, or any day again. He needed something to distract himself and keep his hands busy. Since then, he never had a reason to change. He still lived in the same house on the other side of town, and still occasionally frequented the same rundown bar on the way. He imagined he probably would until he died. That day, with everything else on his mind, he didn't much consider the tricycle's movement. He knew that he was the only one with a key to the shed, and most likely the only person to have visited the grounds since his previous shift. But without thinking or caring much about it, he simply put it back in its place. There it stayed until the following Monday, when he found it hanging in the tree on the opposite side of the grounds. For 22 years since, every Monday had started with Henry beginning his week by looking around the cemetery for the tricycle. It had become a bit of a game of hide and seek, in which he didn't know who or what he was playing with. But every Monday he would find the thing far from the corner of the shed he had left it in the Monday before. He never told anyone about it, partially because he didn't have anyone to tell. He only had passing conversations with the barkeeps and postmen through the years, but also because it felt like a cosmic secret only he held. Someone or something was speaking to him in a language only they understood. But this Monday was the first time he had ever found it on the roof. Most of the locations around the yard had been recycled dozens of times through the years. There's only so much real estate, but somehow this particular spot had never been used before, and it gave him pause. He reflected on the times he had tried to stake it out over the 2 decades. There had been many. One Sunday in March of some year he remembered because it seemed like a strange way to spend Easter. He tried to set a trap. It wasn't the first time, but they all ended with him empty-handed, none the wiser, and racked with guilt. Countless times he had stayed up, staring directly at it through a Sunday night, only to find himself waking from a sleep he didn't know he had taken, its corner of the shed empty, and it already waiting in the yard. His heart was never in the confrontation. He would try a couple times each year out of some perceived obligation, but never with any success. Mostly, he just kept repeating the routine and lived life in a day-to-day manner, month after month, year after year. It was only a few times that he got the wild notion to set out on a new life, head southwest where his last remaining brother still lived, or set out on a personal voyage of self-discovery. But he never did, maybe because the thing had in a way became the most intimate companion he had. Here he was on this Monday, trying to shield his eyes from the sun in vain as he stared up at it in its new resting place, like a desperate and clueless lover. Having not seen it in this particular position in 22 years scrambled his heart and left him unsure of how to proceed. Why would it suddenly change when he had grown so accustomed and even comfortable with the way things were? He thought of his wife. It was an insult, but the same sinking feeling of abandonment, adrift and alone, was mockingly familiar. He was again stranded and solitary. He considered leaving it up there. Maybe this new dynamic could lead to some answers or insights, anything than the nothing he had learned while his beard turned gray and his hair thinned. Or perhaps this was his chance to seize control of the relationship, assert himself, or break free completely. But by the time he left that day, he had picked it off the roof. He could reach it by just standing on his toes, and put it back in its place in the shed, back in its Monday place that it had stayed in every Monday for the last 22 years. The next day, he broke the routine by stopping by the cemetery on an off day. He couldn't resist checking to see if it was still in the corner. On the drive over, he had a vision of it not being there at all. He imagined himself searching all through the yard, checking their usual spots, only to never find the faded pink bike. The thought swelled in him with an ache and dread that he didn't understand and frightened him. He never realized how attached he had become to the thing. Henry knew that if he were to search the cemetery and not find it, he couldn't bear it. What he found when he arrived shocked him. The thing was back on the roof. He had never seen it move twice in a week, much less twice in 2 days, and for some reason, he had theorized that if he were to find it in the yard that day, it would be in one of their usual spots and things would go back to normal. This blatant defiance outraged and humiliated him. He was again shielding the sun from his eyes as he stared up at the bike. Every option he considered had been exhausted at some point in the 264 months that their dance had ensued. He considered taking it home, which he had only attempted a few times before because it made him feel dirty and somehow ashamed, like he was stealing or violating something. After casting aside these oppressive sentiments, he would find himself waking much like he did when sleeping in the graveyard, and the bike all the way back in its place in the shed. He knew he wasn't going to be delivered some revelation here and now, so he stood and stared with the sun in his eyes. Most of the day passed like this, with him running hopeless loops through his head, plans of action around in his mind. He knew that no matter what he did, he couldn't predict where the bike would be tomorrow, and the idea of it disappearing from the yard completely had anchored in his gut. He plotted, playing it cool, moving it back, trusting that it would be wherever it would be in 2 days, just like it always had. But something had changed. The rhythm had snapped. The trust was gone. The day yielded to his stare, and the moon came to caress his sunburnt face. With the dark sky above, he practiced his sensual worship. Henry took the thing down from the roof, carried it back to his truck, and held it in his arms. He clutched it tenderly, like he might have held his child had he had the chance, stroking the rough and ugly plastic with a loving touch. He stayed the night. They spent the hours together with the peeking stars. Before he woke, he placed it back in its place.